In 2017, the shocking murder of Emanuel Gallmann, the son of prominent Kenyan conservationist Kuki Gallmann, brought international attention to the escalating violence in Kenya's rural regions. This brutal act of violence, which took place in the heart of Africa's fragile ecosystems, is a reminder of the intersection between organized crime, land disputes, and the rise of violent gangs in Kenya. Emanuel Gallmann, a 35-year-old Italian national, was tragically killed by a gang of armed assailants in Laikipia County, an area known for its game reserves, ranches, and conservation efforts. His murder wasn't an isolated event, but rather part of a growing pattern of violence linked to land disputes and criminal activity that has plagued parts of Kenya in recent years. This video will explore the circumstances surrounding Emanuel's death, the gang involved in his murder, and how the incident fits into the broader context of Kenya's land conflicts, organized crime, and the violent escalation of violence in rural areas. Kuki Gallmann, a legacy of conservation and conflict. Kuki Gallmann, an Italian-born conservationist, has been a prominent figure in Kenya for decades. She is best known for her work in the conservation and protection of Kenya's wildlife and the establishment of the Gallmann Memorial Safari Park in Laikipia. The park, which she established in 1992, has been dedicated to the preservation of the region's biodiversity and wildlife, including endangered species like rhinos and elephants. Kuki's passion for wildlife conservation and her commitment to the preservation of Kenya's natural heritage made her a beloved figure in the country. However, her work also placed her at the crossroads of some of the country's most contentious and violent issues, particularly land disputes. Land has been a critical and divisive issue in Kenya for decades. In rural areas like Laikipia, conflicts over land ownership, access, and usage have escalated, particularly with growing pressure on the country's resources. Over time, land disputes have become increasingly entangled with criminal activity, including organized gangs and militias, exacerbating tensions and fostering an environment of violence. Emanuel Gallmann, Kuki's son, was involved in his mother's conservation efforts. Tragically, his life would be cut short amid the very tensions that she had sought to alleviate. His murder represents the growing violence linked to Kenya's land conflicts and the rise of criminal gangs operating in the region. The murder, a brutal attack in Laikipia. On the night of April 23, 2017, Emanuel Gallmann was killed in a violent attack on the Gallmann family's property in Laikipia County. He had been visiting the family ranch, situated in a region known for its game reserves and ranches. The Gallmann family's property, along with others in the area, had become a target for violent gangs, some of which were connected to larger criminal organizations. The attackers, heavily armed and with a history of violent crime, stormed the ranch, shooting and killing Emanuel. His death was a brutal reminder of the escalating violence in Kenya's rural regions, where criminal gangs, often motivated by land disputes, have gained influence. At the time of his murder, Emanuel was believed to be an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of a larger conflict. The gangs operating in Laikipia were involved in a range of illicit activities, including cattle rustling, land invasions, and violent attacks on landowners. These gangs were often supported or protected by local political figures, or even involved in organized crime syndicates. The murder sent shockwaves through Kenya and the international community, as it highlighted the increasing risks faced by landowners, conservationists, and others working in areas where land disputes and organized crime intersect. The Kenyan gang involved. The gang responsible for Emanuel Gallmann's murder was believed to be part of a larger network of criminal groups operating in Laikipia County. These gangs, often referred to as land invaders, have been involved in violent confrontations with landowners, particularly those who own large ranches, conservancies, or game reserves. Land invasions have become a growing problem in Kenya, particularly in the Laikipia region, where vast tracts of land are used for wildlife conservation, commercial farming, and ranching. Some of these criminal gangs are composed of local pastoralists, herders, and unemployed youth, often facing landlessness and poverty. Many of them claim to be fighting for access to land, which they see as their ancestral right, while others are simply using land disputes as a pretext for committing crimes. These gangs, often armed with automatic rifles, are known for their brutal tactics. They have been involved in cattle rustling, the destruction of property, and the intimidation or even killing of landowners. In some cases, the land invasions have been politically motivated, with politicians allegedly backing the gangs to create unrest and destabilize areas during election periods. The gangs often receive protection or support from local elites, making it difficult for authorities to effectively combat the violence. The rise of these gangs, linked to organized crime, is a result of several factors. One major driver has been the breakdown of law and order in some parts of Kenya, where the state has struggled to assert its authority over rural areas. In these regions, gangs have been able to flourish, operating with impunity and committing violent acts without facing significant consequences. Furthermore, land disputes are deeply rooted in Kenya's colonial and post-colonial history. During the colonial era, land was taken from indigenous communities and given to white settlers, many of whom built large commercial farms. After independence, the redistribution of land became a contentious issue, with the government failing to adequately address the grievances of marginalized communities. Over the years, land ownership has remained highly unequal, with large areas still controlled by a few wealthy individuals or corporations. This backdrop of land inequality, coupled with rising poverty, unemployment, and a lack of access to resources, has contributed to the growth of criminal gangs in areas like Laikipia. These gangs, often armed and organized, have targeted wealthy landowners, including conservationists like Kuki Gallmann, as symbols of the land disparities in Kenya. Political and social dimensions. Emanuel Gallmann's murder cannot be viewed in isolation from the broader socio-political context in which it occurred. The violence in Laikipia is part of a larger pattern of unrest and land-related conflicts that have plagued Kenya for decades. In many ways, this violence is linked to the failure of successive governments to address the deep-rooted issues of land distribution, poverty, and political corruption. During election years, these tensions are often exacerbated, as political leaders may attempt to gain favor among disenfranchised groups by aligning with landless populations or militias. The political manipulation of land issues has contributed to the persistence of violence in rural Kenya, where local gangs, sometimes supported by political actors, continue to challenge landowners and conservationists. The Gallmann family's connection to land conservation also made them targets, as advocates for sustainable land use and the protection of wildlife. Kuki Gallmann and her family were seen by some as part of the broader problem of land inequality. Large conservation projects, particularly those that use land for wildlife reserves and ranching, have often been criticized for excluding local communities and not providing them with adequate benefits. In this volatile environment, the Gallmanns were vulnerable to attack, and their property became a symbol of the land conflicts that have fueled violence in the region. A tragic loss and unresolved tensions. The murder of Emanuel Gallmann sparked a wave of outrage and condemnation, both within Kenya and internationally. His death was seen as a senseless act of violence, committed in the context of deep-rooted socio-political issues. While the gang responsible for the murder was identified, the investigation and legal proceedings surrounding the case were slow, and the perpetrators were not brought to justice immediately. Kuki Gallmann, devastated by the loss of her son, has continued her work in conservation, but the murder has undoubtedly left a lasting scar on her family and their legacy. The Gallmann Memorial Safari Park, once a beacon of hope for wildlife conservation, has been forced to contend with the challenges of violence and insecurity in the region. Unfortunately, Emanuel's death is not an isolated incident. The murder highlights the ongoing violence tied to land disputes and organized crime in Kenya, and the vulnerability of conservationists and landowners in rural areas. If you found this story about the tragic murder of Emanuel Gallmann and the violent dynamics surrounding it insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.